Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall and you're listening to part 2 of my interview with Dr Russell Bicknell on the horseshoe crabs. This second part of the interview covers their past and their extensive fossil record, the present with what it means to be a living fossil, and their future under the threat of extinction. And obviously, if you've not yet listened to the first part of this interview and don't know what a horseshoe crab is, then I suggest that would be the best place to start. There's not much news for you at the minute, just know that all the Paleocast family are busy working away on their various projects. So if you want to support us as we do those, then please like us on social media. Whatever the platform, you'll find us at Paleocast for the podcast, Virtual NHM for the digital museum we're developing, and Paleocast GN for our games review project. Likes, shares, comments, subscribes, and reviews all help the show get seen by more people, so you, our audience, can have such a huge positive impact on the show. For this episode, I'd love for you to send some horseshoe crab appreciation back to Russell. Let him know what in this interview surprised you, or what your favourite horseshoe crab fact has been. And as always, we hope you enjoy this episode. So let's go back to 480 million years, you said. Was that their first appearance in the fossil record, yes?
As far as I know, I believe there's some ongoing research to suggest there's actually an older specimens. But in terms of what's currently being published, yes, the Xiphosura is the oldest representative.
And was that particular, that one specimen, was it just effectively a horseshoe crab in some really old rocks? Was it very different?
I would really love for it effectively to look like a modern day horseshoe crab in old rocks. That would be awesome. Because that would really support the idea of them being this quintessential illustration of stasis evolution. However, the things in the Xiphosura of Morocco, they have the same features as a modern day horseshoe crab, but they're very, I suppose, rough around the edges is a way I would describe them. They don't have the really quintessential look of a horseshoe crab as we know them today, and as we know them from the late Jurassic, for example. They still have that 3 main segments, so the head part, the thoracotron, or the sort of the butt end, and then the talcin. But especially the head part, they haven't really developed that horseshoe shaped so much. And the rear end, as opposed to being just one solid hunk of exoskeleton, you see quite obvious segmentation, which is still evident during the development of modern-day horseshoe crabs, but is not observed in the adult individuals, whereas these very ancient forms have the segmentation all the way through to adult individuals.
So of the horseshoe crabs we have alive today, there's just 4 species. Have they always been incredibly low diversity, low numbers of them, and low disparity, not very much difference between those species in the fossil record?
So if we focus specifically from, let's say, the Carboniferous, where you had those giant arthropods, horseshoe crabs were there at that point in time. And that was really their first, I suppose, pulse of evolution, as their first real foray into becoming somewhat diverse. We see in the Carboniferous a range of different shapes, still with that horseshoe head and that those three main segments. That was mostly, though, associated with the exploration of freshwater conditions. So the horseshoe crabs, most of the horseshoe crabs, I should say, of the Carboniferous are considered to be freshwater animals. And to sort of deal with living in those environments, you see a really nice array of evolutionary exploration, trying to find ways and means of dealing with living in an environment that's very different to their marine ancestry. The other main period of time where we see another explosion of diversity is actually in the Triassic. So, of course, the end Permian wiped out, 95% of all things ever. Somehow, our lovely little horseshoe crabs made it through the biggest extinction to ever see the face of the earth. And it is at least my opinion that at least during this period of time, there was a whole bunch of ecological space, so to speak, that needed, well, not needed, but that could have been exploited. And horseshoe crabs, they sort of went a little bit wild at this time. So you get a really massive array of crazy forms during the Triassic. One of my favorite animals of all time within the horseshoe crab realm, that is this thing called Austrolimulus. And the description of one of my vertebrate colleagues when he saw this was, "Is it a pickaxe?" And it basically looks like if you took a horseshoe crab and then you pulled out its side bits, its what we call the genal spines, to make an axe. It is an amazing example of what evolution can do in some very interesting conditions. Once again, though, these weird forms and this quite high abundance diversity is associated with the exploration of some more freshwater conditions as opposed to the traditional marine origins of horseshoe crabs and also the environments in which they live today. So I would answer that question in saying there have been periods of increased diversity and increased disparity. But the other thing to bear in mind is their exoskeleton doesn't preserve particularly well. So unlike, say, a crustacean, which has some really hard shell, horseshoe crab cuticle it's hard, but it's not that hard. So you need sort of the right conditions and those sort of Goldilocks conditions, if you will, for allowing them to be saved in the fossil record. So it may be that the interpretation that I've just presented is, in fact, an artifact of that variable preservation of these animals.
Okay, so they have had times of increased diversity and times of increased disparity, difference between individuals, but that's relative. Can we quantify it? How many species of horseshoe crab have there ever been, and when were they at the peak? And is that peak of diversity, are we talking like 20 species? Are we talking like 20,000 species like there are of trilobites? Where does it stand in terms of diversity when we look at different groups of organisms?
So I suppose it depends on how you define a horseshoe crab, really. But if we are focusing, let's make it easier for ourselves. Let's focus on things that we definitely know are horseshoe crabs, not things that may be related somehow. So I would say the highest diversity in terms of species was during the Carboniferous. Off the top of my head, I think there are 30 documented species. However, I am almost certain that some of those reflect oversplitting of the organisms. So it's probably less than 30, almost definitely less than 30 at that point in time. The other period, as I mentioned, was the Triassic. During the Triassic, I believe there were at least 15 genera alive. And probably, yeah, I would wager all of those genera are probably monospecific as well. So in that case, 15 different species during the Triassic. But of course, this pales in comparison to the aforementioned trilobites that are just this have this amazing diversity, mostly because of the preservation of their exoskeleton, of course.
Sure. So why are there so few fossils? So you've said about the preservation of the exoskeleton. Yeah, they're not going to get as well preserved as something like a crab that biomineralizes with calcium carbonate. So it's kind of like the difference, I think. Horseshoe crabs are like your fingernails. They're kind of pliable. Their head, they've not got minerals in it. Whereas something like a crab can be more porcelaneous, more like a plate in a way. But when we think about biases in the fossil record, you're saying that the peak of horseshoe crab diversity has come from the Carboniferous. Now, obviously, if you know the Carboniferous, it's synonymous with coal. There's forests everywhere. There's people digging up coal all over the world at that time. And many of these horseshoe crab fossils I know come from coal measures, coal deposits. People have found them when they've been digging for coal. So those that period in time is very, very well collected indeed. And so is that responsible, that collection at that time, for the relatively high number of horseshoe crabs? And are the low number of horseshoe crabs in different periods reflective of less collector effort, fewer people looking in those rocks of that time for horseshoe crabs?
So I would say almost definitely to the first part. The Carboniferous, as you said, is so well sampled, especially the late Carboniferous. Because of coal. So there's been a whole lot of collecting, whether or not it was done with the intention of discovering new things. It was conducted anyway. So there is, in that regard, definitely a collector bias. Though I would say that the preservational potential comes into play later down the line. So the Cenozoic, so the period of time after the old dinosaurs did their thing, is very well sampled, in my opinion, because it's the most recent rocks. And there is only one known horseshoe crab fossil species, which is represented by 4 individuals from the entirety of the Cenozoic. So at this point in time, the preservation of their, as you quite rightly outlined, their softer or comparatively softer exoskeleton was very, very low. There weren't many conditions that would have allowed them to be preserved. And so effectively from the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs to today, we don't really have all that much information about what they were doing simply because they weren't preserved.
But when we look at the ones that are preserved, okay, so if we say that 1 in a million horseshoe crab is going to be preserved in the fossil record, then, okay, we might get 20 species from the Carboniferous, but we've got more than 20 individual fossils preserved of each species. So if you're getting 1 in a million and it's coming out as this species, that species, that species, and quite a few numbers of those. Does that reflect the actual diversity of the group?
It depends how you ask us.
So what I'm getting at is are there lots of different horseshoe crabs that we just don't know about, or are they actually genuinely like just a few species, a handful of species like we have today?
So that really comes down to the reading of the fossil record, doesn't it? And how much emphasis we want to put on the fact that the fossil record preserves a minuscule percentage of what was and has been alive on Earth today. I personally am of the opinion that given what we've seen, especially after the end Permian extinction, that there have been periods of time during which horseshoe crabs were fairly abundant. That there are periods of time that the fossil record gives, I suppose, hints at the heyday of the horseshoe crabs actually having been there. Of course, these are incredibly abundant relative to the modern day 4 species across 3 genera. But once again, I suppose this is just a question of an opinion, really, in how you want to read the fossil record. I'm particularly invested in these animals, rather obviously, and so for me, the idea that they have this, or they could have had, more accurately, a very colourful fossil history is something that I'm, I suppose, more inclined to support than the idea that they have sort of struggled along as a low diversity group, and their extant diversity basically reflects this history of not much changing at all.
Okay. And do you think that we might be able to find more fossil horseshoe crabs if we look more in the different rocks that have been undersampled and in the different areas that have been undersampled?
Absolutely. Yeah. I am very much of the opinion that there are parts of the world that just haven't been explored enough, because of, I suppose, later colonization, or just simply no interest in the rock material there, or there was something that was more important, and that the exploration of these particular rock units of the right age and the right environment, which of course is key, will undoubtedly uncover more material. Of course, in saying that, I think that's almost the case for every kind of paleontology. The more we look at different kinds of rocks that have been underexplored, the more that we can actually find.
Okay, so looking at the fossil horseshoe crabs that we know of, how much have they changed over time, if at all? And that's a question from Brandon.
So the answer to that, I think, depends on at what point in time you want to look. I've already ranted and raved about the Triassic horseshoe crabs, things that look like a pickaxe, animals that have just very strange forms. One, in fact, was actually named after Darth Vader, because the head section looks like Darth Vader's helmet. So
this is news to me. What's that one called?
Have you never? Oh, you're missing out. Right, so oh, dude, I'm upset. Right, so a colleague of mine, Alan Lerner, published and co. Published a paper in 2017 naming a horseshoe crab from the Triassic Vaderlimulus, because the prosoma looks like the helmet of Darth Vader. which I think is just an awesome story as far as I'm concerned.
I've just got your paper up now. The new paper that you came out with, detailing every fossil horseshoe crab. I want to see this. And everyone else do the same. Okay, Vaderlimulus E. It does actually look a little bit like Darth Vader.
Yeah.
But then they all do, really.
Okay, yeah, that is fair. I think the very long spines on the side were the justification for the name. But to get back to the question that was asked, so there have been periods of time in which they have been very, I suppose, diverse. But then as you get closer to modern day, you start to see organisms or horseshoe crabs in particular, that look very, very similar to the modern day horseshoe crab. So the world famous Solnhofen limestone from Germany, South Germany, they have horseshoe crabs there that you could swear are basically the same thing as a modern day horseshoe crab. The differences are so minute that you could probably put them side by side and you'd almost be convinced they're the same thing. And as we get even closer to modern day, at the late Cretaceous fossils of North America, I can't remember exactly where, has actually been put in the same genus as the modern day American horseshoe crab. And that's basically because it is the splitting image of what you see on the beaches of North America during the summer. And then into as I mentioned, the one example of fossil horseshoe crabs in the Cenozoic, that thing from Germany. The Germans have this amazing fossil record of horseshoe crabs. That thing is sort of bounced around between being placed in the same genus as the American horseshoe crab and the same genus as the horseshoe crabs that we see off the coast of China and Japan. Once again, just because you could basically put it next to any of those different genera and it looks basically the same. So there is a point in time where you see a massive decrease in diversity. This is basically after the Triassic. You see a real big drop off, if by no other measure, because there are not that many genera in fossil horse crabs that are younger than the Triassic, and you also see this point of time where this highly conserved shape, the quintessential horseshoe crab shape, if you will, becomes prevalent.
Is it therefore correct that we consider them to be living fossils? Is it correct from the Cretaceous to the modern? Do you even agree with living fossil as a term?
Oh, I have a love-hate relationship with that term, if I'm to be honest. It's an oxymoron for starters. It only works if the thing in the fossil record is exactly the same species as what we see today. In that regard, I suppose there are, and this is showing my knowledge of weird things, planktic foraminifera that are living fossils. Not that you really care about those sorts of things, but there are individuals in the fossil record that are of the same genus and species that are alive today. But beyond that, I personally don't believe it is a term that should be so readily employed, just because of that oxymoronic nature. Horseshoe crabs in particular, of course, have been referred to as one of the pillars of this living fossil idea. I would say that without a doubt, they have this conserved morphology. So from an evolutionary perspective, they definitely look the same in the Jurassic limestones as they do today, albeit they're a lot smaller than the modern-day horseshoe crabs. But there are still changes that we observe. So in that regard, while I understand the use of the term living fossil, I personally don't really align with using it. And of course, it assumes effectively that there has been very little or no evolutionary change within the organism leading up to the individuals that are alive today. And while we may not see any morphological change in the fossil record, and of course that's effectively all that we're left to see, there may be behavioral modifications that we simply don't have, and therefore we can't make statements about.
I hate the term. And I've seen books so well published, just like the most beautiful books you've ever seen, that juxtapose fossil organisms with modern organisms and say, look, this is exactly the same. Evolution does not exist. And they've got a picture of Xiphosura from the Solnhofen, the same fossil locality as you get Archaeopteryx, the Jurassic one, and then the modern American horseshoe crab. They say it's exactly the same. Evolution is a lie. And you look at the two and you're like, well, I look at the two, sorry, and I'm like, yeah, the different species. What's your point? They look superficially similar, but they're not the same. They have just, those three parts that we've talked about, the prosoma, the thoracotron, the post abdomen, and the tail spine. And that's as far as I think most people view horseshoe crabs. They just see those parts. And again, it's the same with trilobites. You see the parts, those three parts, and even people today would look at horseshoe crabs and trilobites and pretty much see the same things. And there's so much difference between the two, between horseshoe crabs and trilobites, and horseshoe crabs and other horseshoe crabs. And I don't think that many people recognize just how different these things are, if not for superficial similarities, but just they're just not the same. I don't like it. and even things, like with Lingula, the brachiopod. Okay, that genus has existed since the Cambrian.
Yep.
I think it is.
Yep.
It's just a very simple brachiopod. And that is another one that has gone through what you'd say is morphological stasis. It's just this one form, this one shape, this one ecology that just works. You don't really need to change anything to do with the superficial shape. It works, and so why change it? But then that's not to say that the organism that has that shape has not changed itself.
Yeah, no.
And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, no.
Just don't use that term or I'll come and stamp on your toe. I don't know what response I was looking for that, but that's just a little paleocast rant for you all.
I mean, to be fair, I probably don't agree as strongly as with your perspective. But I think it's important to realize that the term, it has its place, I suppose, most often in popularizing potentially of certain parts of paleontology. But the idea that living fossil equals no evolution, that for me makes absolutely no sense. Just because something is very similar today as it is in the fossil record doesn't mean that evolution doesn't happen. That is just nonsense. And the use of the term to support the idea that the research presented by Darwin and then revisited by, I would honestly say, countless biologists. I don't know if you even could quantify how many people have studied evolution. But the idea that the presence of conservation in the fossil record equals no evolution is just an insult, frankly, to 2 centuries worth of thinking, observing, studying with this intent of understanding how we've got to be where we are. And I think the fossil record is just really important in understanding that. So making those sorts of links is just rude, to be honest.
So that was a question from Brandon. So thanks for sending that in. So talking about their morphological stasis and how they've not changed very much over time, has their ecology and paleogeography changed over time? So where they're living, what they're doing?
That's a really good question. I am probably going to be starting to sound like a broken record at some point here, because I will probably keep referring to key points of time during which they were doing different things. So once again, we come back to the Carboniferous. During this period of time, a lot of what they were doing was inland, the freshwater conditions, as opposed to the marine conditions that we are very familiar with them today, and also other points in the fossil record. Undoubtedly, their paleoecology would have had to have modified to capitalize on living in freshwater conditions. There's an array of interesting papers that presented hypotheses that came out in the 70s and the 80s that around how horseshoe crabs may have tried to mimic spiders and mimic leaves.
What?
Yeah, look up Fisher 1977.
I don't think I want to.
It's a fever dream. I shouldn't speak poorly. He was a brilliant worker on horseshoe crabs in the 70s and leading into the 80s. In fact, was one of the first people to present a phylogeny, a family tree of horseshoe crabs. But yes, there were some interesting, weird ideas in the 70s around what the freshwater variants of the Carboniferous were doing. In the Triassic, similar exploration of those freshwater conditions. And so the Carboniferous horseshoe crabs probably weren't living in, or if they were living in unidirectional water, only some of them would have been, because some of the Carboniferous horseshoe crabs actually lose some of their spines. They look basically like 2 blobs and a tail on the end of it. So they would have been living in slightly different conditions. But in the Triassic, where you have these things like Xiphosura, you have these things like Austrolimulus, they were undoubtedly living in very in freshwater conditions with very fast unidirectional water flow. So their head basically had to change how they were looking, how they were doing what they were doing to survive. So they have these what we call hypertrophied, or just made really big head spines to deal with this unidirectional water flow of living in freshwater conditions. Of course, living in freshwater conditions, the actual food sources would have been a lot different to what we see today. Although, in that being said, horseshoe crabs don't actually eat all that much. The majority of their diet is whatever the hell they can shovel into their mouths that's on the seafloor. So there may have been different prey items, but I doubt that there would have been a lot of difference in terms of exactly what they were eating, how they were affecting the ecology around them. And then leading into, once again, the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, you get to this point where horseshoe crabs look pretty normal, well, normal inverted commas, and you can infer that what they were doing at this point was more or less how they were functioning, how they function today, and would have basically fit effectively the same ecological niche, or the same ecological spot that our modern day horseshoe crabs do.
And why has the horseshoe crab lineage survived for so long? And that's a question from Sissy.
I have spent hours thinking about that question, to be honest. I think about it in the context of the trilobites going extinct at the end Permian, and the same with the sea scorpions. I mean, those groups of arthropods were frankly amazing. What they did with their body plan across the Paleozoic was just phenomenal. And yet you have these weird, and in the Paleozoic they were small horseshoe crab things that made it through that extinction, did a bunch of weird stuff in the Triassic, and then calmed right down by the Jurassic, and then made it through another extinction event to be where they are today. And I think in part it comes down to where they were living at the time. So the extinction event that killed off the dinosaurs had less of an impact on marine animals than it did on land animals, right? So the fact that horseshoe crabs were almost exclusively marine at that point probably gave them the advantage. The end Permian, that's a different story. That extinction did some pretty damage on everything. And we don't actually have all that much information about animals, about what horseshoe crabs looked like in the Permian. The record isn't that amazing. But from what we do see, there were a couple of freshwater things. One that I described last year from the state of Tasmania that probably gave rise to a lot of those really, really extreme animals, so Austrolimulus and Betalimulus. And then we had other forms that are probably marine again. So, but exactly how horseshoe crabs made it through that extinction event, I honestly don't know. I suppose more broadly, it's a case of they have a design that is pretty much nothing really wants to eat them. If I have only heard of one story of someone trying to eat a horseshoe crab, and it was a guy at my university who had read my thesis and said that
sounds tasty.
No, quite the opposite. He was on holiday in Thailand, I think, and he saw the horseshoe crabs in the tank next to a lobster and decided that he wanted to try a horseshoe crab.
No.
Yeah, it makes me sad to think this is the case because obviously, not obviously, but I find them to be very charismatic animals, and the idea of eating one makes me uncomfortable. But he tried. Cost him about $50, which is what, £25? I think that's the conversion rate, which is quite a bit of money. And he was sick for 2 days straight. So they're not palatable, and there's not much to them. In fact, they are basically 90% shell, well, exoskeleton, sorry. So once they sort of reach this point of being so big as what they are today, they probably didn't have many selective pressures from predators. So in that regard, they have almost put themselves in a position where they don't need to worry about being eaten, at least when they get to that adult stage, as we already discussed. During the juvenile developmental stage, they are quite vulnerable. But in terms of exactly how they have survived the last 480 million years, I honestly, especially the end Permian, I kind of chalk it up to luck. I mean, which probably isn't a fair answer, but when I really think about it, unless someone can show me what a horseshoe crab looked like just before and just after that extinction event, I really don't know.
And so with that in mind, if it's potentially just kind of lucky, will they survive the next mass extinction? Would you agree if I said that they were a dead clade walking?
So I would not agree with that statement, because while they have low diversity, or low modern day diversity, they are very effective at doing what they do. I would say, however, that their own extinction event is probably going to be at the hands of humans. And in that regard, because humans are very, very good at killing things off, there is a lower chance of them surviving humanity than true abiological extinction events.
So what are some of those challenges that humans impose on the horseshoe crabs?
It varies depending on where you are in the world. So, as we've discussed, there are 4 different species. You have the American horseshoe crab, which is the one that when I say horseshoe crab, people, if they know what they are, it's what they think of. Then there's the Chinese horseshoe crab, the Japanese horseshoe crab, and the Indonesian horseshoe crab. So, and depending on which country you're in and therefore which animal you're talking about, there are different pressures that humans put on them. I'm working with a colleague right now from India who's studying the Indonesian horseshoe crab, and she's telling me that a lot of the problems that they have, and the Indonesian horseshoe crab is the smallest of the lot, so immediately it's already in a little bit of trouble there. They're basically the subject to pretty not great conditions by humans. If they're bycatched, people don't really care about them. My colleague was informing me that some of the local people, they'll collect them and they'll snap the tail off, and then they'll sell the talcum. They aren't really respected in terms of like treated the same way you would treat a cat or a dog. I've seen photos of horseshoe crabs with rocks stuck in their prosoma. So in that regard, there's, I suppose, just general poor treatment. Luckily, the Chinese and Japanese horseshoe crabs, I think it is the Japanese horseshoe crab is now considered an endangered animal on the IUCN Red List. I can't remember what IUCN stands for, but International Union of something, Conservation of something. So at least at this point now, there are rules around poor treatment of at least that taxon. But Limulus, the American horseshoe crab, is the big issue. So Limulus blood is refined to make a chemical that is used by the medical industry to determine whether or not a solution has any kind of impurity in it. Now, this development, which I think was first published in the 60s, circumvented the need for basically testing on bunches and bunches and bunches of rabbits. So obviously you have fewer rabbits being killed, which is great. But to keep up with the increased demand associated with an increased population of humans on Earth, more and more of the American horseshoe crab have been harvested. A third of their blood is removed, and they are then put back into the ocean. The realization that effectively, because they are what we call lower order invertebrates, so they're not like cuttlefish, they're not like octopus, they're not what we call intelligent, very inverted commas there. The realization that they were being poorly treated because of that has since resulted in a lot more control over how the sampling is conducted and how much blood is taken and how long until they get put back into the wild. But we are already beginning to see a selection towards females, which are the larger of the two gender, that are smaller than what we would have seen 30 to 40 years ago. So in that regard, humans are effectively pushing a selective change in these animals, because, of course, the larger your individual is, the more blood it has, therefore the more blood you can remove without breaking laws. So we're now getting to this point that the potential ability to reproduce effectively and produce viable offspring is going to be impacted because you have small females. So in that regard, unless something is done to change the use of blue blood, bearing in mind that there has been a chemical that has been synthesized that does exactly the same thing, we may find ourselves in a situation where, the modern day horseshoe crab becomes close to being extinct.
The use of horseshoe crabs by humans has been, it's staggering just how abused a species they are. I remember when I first started researching the exoskeletons, I came across some of the things that they used to do earlier in this century in terms of fertilizer. So chitin, which is the material that they're mostly made of, their exoskeletons, the chemical is N-acetyl glucosamine, which is it contains nitrogen. So you've got all of these crabs on the beach. It's free nitrogen just walking around. That stuff's expensive, like fertilizer. So they used to get like these large combine harvesters, I don't know what you'd call it, lawn mowers. And whilst they're all there mating on the beach, just drive along, chop them all up, and you've got a big container full of fantastic fertilizer. And there's pictures of just thousands and thousands of crab exoskeletons just piled up ready for use in fertilizer. And then, as you said, with the blood, anyone that has had their life saved by medicine has probably had their life saved by horseshoe crabs.
Yep.
Any immunization that you have, anything that has a fluid effectively is, tested using horseshoe crab blood. So we owe them all our lives, and yet they're on the verge of becoming extinct.
Unfortunately, that is the case. And it does bug me to know that we have synthesized a chemical that does effectively the same job. But, of course, what humans can synthesize in, let us say, conservatively 20 years is going to pale in comparison to what evolution has refined over 480 million. So while I suppose I can see the perspective of the medical industry from a conservation perspective, there needs to be a transition away from using their blood to make certain that, of course, any injections or anything that goes into a human is safe, and towards using what we can synthesize in order to help these things not go extinct.
But why pay 30 cents per test when something crawls up on the beach for free?
Yep, that's well, to be honest, that's basically the perspective. I mean, blue blood, I think, goes for $10,000 American per liter or something insane like that. And it's just a case of they're there. There are very few rules around actually the treatment of them because they aren't so-called intelligent invertebrates. And they are, at least in the short term of the year to year, an apparently continual resource. So I see the perspective and I see the capitalism. But from my perspective, these are animals that need to be treated with a lot more respect than what they have been so far, and that has to come, of course, at a cost for humans.
Why is their blood blue anyway? That's a question from Brandon.
So it is rich in copper, contrasting ours, which is rich in iron. I always forget what the correct term of for their blue blood is. It's hemo something or other.
Hemocyanin.
There we go. Awesome. There. Thank you.
It's all right. Thank you, Wikipedia.
But yeah, so effectively it is a different way of building a blood system that's based in the use of copper as opposed to the use of iron.
So on all of those positive notes, what is the future of horseshoe crab research?
For myself personally or globally speaking?
First one, then the other.
All right. So as you've already mentioned, I have, in conjunction with my colleague Steve Pates, put out this atlas of all horseshoe crab species, which has been the result of effectively 3 years of a lot of emails and a lot of travel. I can tell you that Russia is really far from Australia, especially when you don't sleep for 28 hours. I was dumb. Should not have done. We've been coming from an Australian summer, which was bushfire central, into -2 degrees. Yeah, no, not a smart move. Anyway, so building on that, there's a lot of questions that we posed around horseshoe crab evolution. So when this evolutionary status arose in time. So that's a question that I'm tackling with, there's like 11 authors on that paper now, doing a whole bunch of data from all of this travel and then looking at various aspects of horseshoe crab development, and if development has changed through time. I'm also doing my taxonomic due diligence and sort of dealing with a few species that have been hanging around for a while and haven't really been worked on thoroughly. I'm not going to touch some of the things from the Carboniferous that have some 20 species in the one genus, because that just sounds like a dog's breakfast. I try to limit my taxonomy to things that I can definitely say one thing is one thing, which I know may be a little bit on the nose, but I have to leave work for somebody else, don't I? And beyond that, I've got a couple of papers in review, 3 papers in review right now, actually. One of them dealing with some Russian taxa, one dealing with some species, 3 species from the States that we are sort of smushing into one, and one in which we name a horseshoe crab after a Pokemon. So there's that, which I think is
Kabutops.
Yeah. I'm not going to tell you anything more. It's going to be cool. Actually, it's not even a species. It's a subfamily. So it's even bigger than a species. So yeah, that's I think probably going to round off the majority of what I'll be doing for the next while. Oh, and working with my colleague in India to really help in the conservation of that the Indonesian horseshoe crab, because not a lot of work's been done on that little dude, and in my opinion, it's probably one of the coolest of the modern day horseshoe crabs. Mostly because they go into freshwater conditions to do their breeding. So it's very different to what we see in all the other species. And I think that weird lifestyle, is that the right word to use there? Ecology, it's getting late here, reflects the small size. Globally speaking, of course, I've got colleagues around the world who are continuing to push forward the paleontology of horseshoe crabs. I've got some colleagues in China who've reached out to me recently, informed me of work that they're doing actually on species that are getting close to the Permian extinction. So there may be some really interesting stuff coming out within the next year or so around that. And the conservation of modern-day horseshoe crabs has become more and more of a public focus, at least in my opinion. I think the last 5 years, maybe even a decade, really championed by the late, I forget his first name, Schuster Jr., Carl, who spent his entire career studying the American horseshoe crab, and his student and one of my mentors, Mark Botten, who have continued to push the understanding of these animals and what we can do to prevent them from going extinct, I think have become really, really important. And I think more broadly speaking, oh God, those are both pretty broad topics, but even broader than that, the recent push in seeing a synthesis of paleontological information with the modern observation, and in viewing and being able to view the importance of conservation through the lens of the paleontological record, and the realization that horseshoe crabs today represent the end of a beautiful lineage and therefore deserve that conservation. I'd say those are really the main directions, beyond, of course, medical research that I am not really going to touch on.
Okay, so in the almost 2 hours that we've been recording this longest paleocast ever, right, we've got plenty of people who are now sitting on the fence of whether or not they should become researchers of horseshoe crabs. What would you say to those people about studying this group of arthropods?
They're amazing. When I first started my PhD, the idea of studying horseshoe crabs did not appeal to me at all. I was hell-bent on only studying the Cambrian explosion, and how wrong I was as a young scientist. I now realize exactly how amazing these organisms are, how important they have been for medical development and for humans. And in my opinion, they represent a really wonderful record of what evolution can do with, frankly, just a very, very simple way of building a body. And so in that regard, I would say just, get into it, because they are such a brilliant group of animals.
Okay, and to finish on, I'm giving you the power to pick one piece of misinformation or an inaccuracy about horseshoe crabs and replace that with one cool fact that you would like people to take away with. So what do you think people get wrong, and what would you like people to take away with them?
They're not crabs, which I suppose is kind of obvious. They are their own group of things related to spiders and scorpions. And the cool thing that I would like people to take away is they swim upside down.
There you go. Okay. Thank you so much, Russell, for coming on the show. It's been fantastic. We've had plenty of rants. We've had plenty of information. And I'm sure we've made everyone sick of horseshoe crabs.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been an amazing evening. Thank you so much.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.